Hello, this time on SitRep, a budget is coming and the rumours are flowing thick and fast. Even the Defence Secretary is among ministers rolling the pitch about painful decisions.
So we will do our part to help this government deal with the deficit this year and the dreadful state of the public finances.
But what are the options for Defence to do its part? If anyone can explain, it's Mike. Also on SitRep, thousands of computer games have been inspired by the real-world actions of armed forces. But it's not just a one-way street. We're in Washington, D.C., where real-world warriors have been doing virtual battle. And
a doctor or a soldier first, a common ask by those unversed in risks they cannot understand.
Former Surgeon General Major General Tim Hodgetts talks to us about soldiering, saving lives, and how writing war poems helped him with both.
SitRep with Kate Chabot and Professor Michael Clark.
So we've been warned painful decisions are on the way, inevitably leaving an information vacuum. And we've seen it time and time again. In those vacuums, rumour and supposition flourish. What the Defence Secretary said didn't exactly do anything to calm things down, did it, Mike?
No, and as you say, he was rolling the pitch. I mean, making it very clear that there will be painful decisions to take in the interest of the public finances. What was interesting, he didn't say in the interest of defence, in the interest of the public finances, because this government has started off its term of office, and I think it's going to be a fairly long term of office, given the majority that they've got. But they've started off saying we have to get the public finances right before any other aspects of our policy really make sense. And growth, if we get growth, then 2% of a bigger cake of growth means more for defence. 3% means even more. And so it's very interesting. I think he phrased his words very carefully. Painful decisions in the interests of public finance.
And we also know, don't we, that some individuals and groups can use these periods of uncertainty to try to push the conversation in a certain direction. What do you think is going on behind the scenes right now?
Oh, well, very clearly. I mean, the Ministry of Defence is reviewed to death. And so they're going through the process again. So they started off cranking the handle of looking at all of the programmes, looking at what's due to be spent on them in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, looking for areas where they might be able to change the spending priorities, delay spending, substitute spending in or substitute a capability in other ways. They're going through all that again, and they've been through it often enough in recent years. And while they do that, interests outside the MOD, of course, are feeding the media with speculation. And some of them are, those speculative stories are designed to scare people, to say we might be looking at this, we might be looking at that. And you always find it in defence reviews. Before the review really gets going, and I can promise you this review hasn't really got going yet. Lots of preparatory work is going on, but it hasn't really got started on the key choices. But before that happens, people are making their pitch. That's really what it is.
And so, Mike, what we're going to try and do here is a bit of a reality check, because we know that all sorts of options are being looked at, because that's the point of a defence review. If we just go back a step, though, John Healey's comments were in response to questions about the upcoming budget and the suggestion it would mean a big defence programme will have to be cut. That idea looks to me like it's getting ahead of itself, because while the budget may or may not cut money for defence, it's for the defence review to decide sometimes considerably later where the axe actually falls if it has to.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, the point is we're going to have a budget very soon now in the next couple of weeks, and that budget will, and a spending review, which hasn't been for a couple of years. So the budget itself will establish spending limits, and those limits may be favourable or unfavourable. We just don't know at this stage. But the Defence Review won't report until next year. So what it is they're going to do with the brown envelope they are given, the Treasury will give them a brown envelope for the coming period, and they'll say, this is what your budget now looks like. What the Defence Ministry will do with that brown envelope is up to them. And in a way, it is quite helpful. It may not feel it, but it's quite helpful that they will know what financial assumptions they are proceeding on very soon now, and will feed into the review itself.
So if the Chancellor were to decide to cut defence spending, she's got a red line that in theory she can't cross, spending the NATO commitment of 2% of GDP on defence. So as she's looking at the numbers, how much would she theoretically cut without breaking that commitment?
Yeah, theoretically. Well, we're spending in cash terms this year about 57 billion, just over 57 billion on defence, which is, depending on how you do the figures, about 2.3% of our GDP. And then if you just work it out, we've got a GDP of about 2.3 trillion pounds. That's 2,300 million pounds. That's our total GDP. So that means that every 0.1% is worth about 2.5 billion. So say she was to bring the defence spending from 2.3 down to, let's say, 2.1, take 0.2% out of it, then that would be about 5 billion. And that would be big. I mean, that would be and it would be a step, most people would say, in the wrong direction. It would be very controversial. But as a mathematical possibility, think of every 0.1% as worth 2.5 billion. And you've got a sort of an order of magnitude to play with.
And whatever the Chancellor decides next month, we know the Defence Review team already has a tough job balancing the books because the current 10-year equipment plan is unaffordable to the tune of £17 billion. That's according to the National Audit Office.
It is, but you've got to be careful with those figures because when they say there's a black hole, what they mean is that on present trends, we may be 17 billion adrift on our expenditure for equipment. But that's if we don't do anything about it, or if things stay the same, or if there's no growth in the economy. Based on current assumptions, the black hole could be as much as 17 billion, but you also find it could be as little as 8 billion or 9 billion, and it could be within the normal, even lower than that, if it was in the normal range of margin of error in some cases. So these figures that get into the headlines, a black hole of 17 billion, it's usually on the basis of the idea that if we do nothing about it between now and 2030, it could be as bad as that. But that would be 17 billion over 8 or 9 years in a budget that will go from about 60 billion to 80 billion. So it's not quite as serious as it sounds. Having said that, they've got to do something about it. They've got to keep the equipment budget on track. And the big issue, Kate, always, and people never seem to quite get this. In 2010, the government, as we're swung onto the MOD, an accounting change whereby they said that the building of the nuclear deterrent, not the running of it, that's always been an MOD cost, but the building of the deterrent will be henceforth put onto the MOD. So the MOD, instead of the Treasury covering it, they say, right, we'll give you the money that we're going to spend on building the deterrent and you look after it. And every time the program, which is now very troubled, every time it runs short of cash or looks as if it's going to overspend, the rest of defence feels the effect of that. And every time they think they've got the budget balanced, the nuclear program comes in with another projected deficit and knocks all the figures sideways.
And Mike, you told us a couple of weeks ago you thought a big programme might end up having to go. I'm not particularly talking about the nuclear programme. And understandably, you didn't want to speculate. Others have not been so cautious. So it feels like time to give some context to that speculation. Let's start with Tempest and the Future Combat Air System, if you don't mind. Arguments in favour for cutting to save money, what would they be?
The arguments in favour of it would be that we haven't spent that much on it yet, and so it would save a big programme. And if you're going to cut something, cutting it halfway through or near the end is, of course, the least efficient way of doing it. So take a big programme that's just beginning, and you immediately save a lot of money on the forward programme for expenditure. So that would be the attraction of going for GCAP, the Global Combat Air Programme.
And what about the arguments against?
Arguments against are that we would put ourselves out of the fifth generation aerospace business with that, largely. More importantly, against that would be the fact that this is a joint program with Italy and Japan. I was at the Italian embassy last night on something completely different, but a lot of Italian journalists were there. And they were telling me, they said, we spend all our time worrying now in the defence business in Italy as to whether Britain is going to pull out of the GCAP program, because that would leave Italy stranded. So there'd be a big political cost to pay with our relations with Italy and with Japan, and also a sense that we'd left the field clear for a Franco-German cooperation because they're going to do their own program and we'll be out of it. And if we wanted a fifth generation aircraft, we'd then probably have to buy an American aircraft down the line, which ultimately might cost us more.
So, Mike, when you weigh up those fors and againsts, where do you stand on Tempest, or where does a balance lie? Is it a serious contender for savings?
It is, only because if we do have to cut into a big program, it's going to be a program at the beginning of its development rather than halfway through. For that reason alone, you have to regard GCAP as a contender for cutting. It's a bit like the TSR2. I remember back in the 1960s when the Labour government came in 1964. I was only a schoolboy, I have to say. But they immediately cut the TSR2, which was a new generation fighter bomber. And there's a huge row about that. And people look at the GCAP program and say, this is the new TSR2.
So, Mike, also being floated by some significantly cutting or totally scrapping our orders for any more F-35 jets. Again, what's the for?
Yeah, well, the for is that we're never going to have the 138 that are planned. Nobody really believes that. We'll top out at something like 80 or 90. But the argument is, well, just delay them. They're 100 million each, more than 100 million each. Just don't go for the 80 or 90. Just go for the minimum that we need. And we're at the minimum now, just about, for what the RAF needs and for in one air wing on the carrier, not an air wing for both carriers. So you could live with that just about, and the RAF has still got its aircraft and the Navy's got its aircraft. I mean, against that is the idea that it's you're just making the force so small it can't be effective. And as we've seen in the Ukraine war, even top range fighter jets go down for all sorts of reasons. We always end up with top of the range equipment that will stand no attrition. But attrition is a feature of every serious fighting war, even some of the expeditionary operations that we've engaged in the last 10 or 15 years. So the idea of having the absolute minimum that you can get by on is a foolish policy. That's the argument against it, even in times of straitened circumstances. We've got the F-35. We're a tier one partner in it, which means that we benefit from every F-35 sold, both to us and around the world. So just keep on doing it. That would be the argument against scrapping the T-35's numbers. And I don't think they will scrap them. In terms of is the contender, it might be. I think they might stretch the order, but they're pretty stretched already.
Okay, what about the Royal Navy? Expensive submarines are in the pipeline, new frigates. How might those be balancing up in the Defence Review? Yeah,
the Type 31 is the new Type 26, which we are getting, which are being built, and the Type 31s, which are not the follow-on version, but the sort of more, I hesitate to say cheap and cheerful version, but a more modularized version designed for export as well. Nobody's entirely sure about that. It might be that orders for the Type 31 are scrapped. It wouldn't be scrapping the whole program because we have to have new frigates. But nevertheless, it's a possibility that they'd say, okay, the 4 or 5 Type 31s will have to go. You just can't have them. And that's a contender because it's a program that hasn't really started. Not too much money has been spent on it yet. And it would be painful because we're down to so few frigates and destroyers for the Navy, as with everything else. I mean, again, it wasn't so long ago that we said that 32 frigates and destroyers were the absolute minimum for Britain's requirements, 32. And now we've got 19, maybe 18. We'd then be down to maybe 15. The number becomes derisory, to be honest.
And what would be the arguments against? Is it exactly that, the size of the fleet?
Yes, that the fleet is unsustainable at a lower level. I mean, see, what we say is, look, we've got one ship for every ocean, and we have trouble when we sent a HMS Diamond down to the Red Sea to do some very important work in relation to keeping the Red Sea open and doing something about the Houthi threat to shipping, which is very active. We could then replace it with one of the Daring class destroyers. But I mean, of the 6 Daring class destroyers we have, 3 of them are alongside. I mean, for various reasons, 3 of them are not at sea. So only 3 of them were at sea, and they're working very, very hard, and the crews are working very, very hard. And so we're already at a level where the Navy is very busy, and it's getting hard to sustain the jobs, even the minimal jobs that they look as if they're doing. And if, heaven forbid, if we had to start to worry about real security in the North Atlantic and the real possibility of sabotage to our systems, both our military systems and our critical infrastructure in the North Atlantic, we simply wouldn't have the ships to do it. And we really would be reliant on our allies to look after our interests.
So, Micah, what about the Army? Less equipment heavy in spending, but still.
Yeah, I mean, the Army's based its equipment around Challenger 3, the Ajax and the Boxer. And we need new artillery. I mean, long-range artillery, something to replace the AS-90 and so on. If the Army had to suffer big program cuts, I think they would be in orders for new multiple launch rocket systems, deep fires, as we say, I mean, long-range artillery. That would be the most vulnerable capability, and air defense. I mean, we know the Army is desperately short of ground-based air defense, which means that any Army deployment onto the continent would be very vulnerable unless our allies are prepared to offer their defence for our forces. So, we don't have an organic British defence for Army deployments abroad that's of any extent. And again, if a programme had to go, it might be that, and it would leave us pretty vulnerable until that programme could be made up again. But say it was delayed for 5 years, 8, 10 years, then it would leave a gap of about that size as we look towards the future.
So if we did have to take another capability holiday, where do you think would make the most strategic sense? And will the review team see it that way?
I'm sure the review team will try to avoid cutting any capability. But what they'll try to do is offer to ministers a series of options. I mean, that's all they can do. They can say, look, we can lose this capability. So we could lose a degree of our naval capability if we cut the frigate numbers yet again, the building. We could get out of the fifth generation air competition with all of the problems that would create for British industry and all the job losses and so on. We could do that. And if you command us to do that, that's what we'll do. But if you want us to try to get through with delays and some stretching of programs, we'll muddle through again if that's what you really want. And it partly depends on how much money they will be required to save. Certainly in the forward program. It's possible that they'd be required to save a fair bit of money now with promises of much greater spending in the time to come. I mean, the Army must be very worried that there's 40 billions worth of expenditure on equipment that the Army has been allocated, but that spending doesn't start till 2026. And so the Army must be concerned that suddenly that will be slashed by half. 20 billion will be taken off Army expenditure for the next 10 years in order to balance the books. And the Army will just have to limp on with the equipment that it can produce in small numbers and keeping old equipment on the go again. They might try that. But the Ministry of Defence, as it doesn't make the decisions, the Ministry of Defence puts to ministers, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and some key ministers. And what usually happens is it'll end up in a discussion over a weekend at Chequers, with 4 or 5 people sitting around saying, okay, here are the big issues. What are we going to do? All the detailed work will be done, and somebody will have to look them in the eye and say, we're going to do that. And that's the way it'll work out.
So Mike, what is sacrosanct and what cannot be touched?
They always say there are no sacred cows. They always say that, but there are. And of course, the nuclear program is a sacred cow. And that's the problem, that the next generation of submarines, the Dreadnought submarines, the program is not going particularly well. It will deliver new submarines built by BAE Systems up in Barrow. But the new warheads that are required, and again, we have to have new warheads because the Americans have a new warhead in development and are producing. And because we have American missiles, we have to have a new warhead that's compatible with it. But our ability to produce warheads at the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment at Aldermaston has been severely compromised by the gap we had for basically 20 years. So we've lost a generation of scientists and technicians who have to be retrained and re-recruited, which is a very expensive process. So the whole nuclear program is a sacred cow, and it's financially, it's not exactly a black hole, but it's not a healthy financial part of the whole system.
Yeah, and Mike, you mentioned earlier the muddling through that's been done in the past. We've done a lot of salami slicing over the last decade and a half, and you said if we're asked, if we're asked to do it, we can do it. Could we do it though? Really, is it possible?
Yes, yeah, you can always keep on salami slicing, and you can live with the hope that you won't be found out, that the lack of capability won't be tested in the real world. And of course, that's what they used to assume before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That was the assumption that actually, look, we've got until about 2030 to sort this out. Well, that's not true. We're in now a situation in Europe where security is absolutely on the line. So yes, you can salami slice. Yes, you can make the books look okay. And you can just live with the hope that the gaps in capability will not be tested in the real world.
So, Mike, how long do we and the men and women of the armed forces have to wait for the answers?
Spring next year. The external advice to the review will be finished this year. That is external inputs, which is the right way round. I mean, in the past, reviews used to go through the process internally and then offer it to the external world to say, what do you think? And of course, it was too late to affect it then. This time, they are doing it the right way round. So there's lots of external inputs going in now, which are due to be there, I think, by December. And it'll be in the spring, probably in the early spring, that the review will be available. So I'd say 6 months from now.
Now, we don't often talk sport on SITREP, but all three services have just taken part in an international tournament where the RAF took second place. The tournament is called Code Bowl, and the name might give you a clue. It's not a traditional sport.
Oh, there's only 2 teams left of us. Perfect. Ain't leaving. I'm not leaving.
This is esports.
You're losing ground. Move it.
The soldiers, sailors and aircrew were playing Call of Duty, and it's a big deal.
Fully removed topside, trying to take shots over against the Royal Air Force right now.
Well, esports aren't just big business with millions of viewers online. They're also something the armed forces take very seriously as a discipline with military benefits. BFBS Forces News reporter Simon Hunter was at Code Bowl in Washington, D.C., and so was WO2 Martin Dixon, the Army's team manager for the tournament. Hi, welcome to both of you. Martin, to you first. How was it?
Yeah, it was really good. It's the second year that I've been there, and yeah, it was even better than the year before.
Big date in the calendar, I bet. Simon, what about you?
Incredible, really, Kate. Yeah, it was. I think the show of ceremony, and in terms of all the hype that came before it, and also indeed on the day of the competition itself, just how much it was celebrated and how much attention was going on it for live streams around the world, and also for everyone who was at the venue. Incredible.
So I said it was a big deal. For people who don't watch esports online, Simon, can you just describe it? It looks like a huge, glitzy production.
It really is. Yeah, glitzy is a perfect word to describe it. So military players from, you've already mentioned the Royal Navy, the British Army, the RAF, going head-to-head against military teams from the US and also Canada, with the Royal Canadian Air Force having won it last year. They go head-to-head in a Call of Duty game. And as you say, with the glitzy nature of it, there's a huge broadcast element as well. So there are sort of news anchor style presentations. There are pundits all over the show as well. Lots of camera angles, trying to get all the best shots as well of these servicemen and women going head to head. And it really is a remarkable thing. And yeah, for all those inter-service rivalries to be taking place is great. But when you bring that global element of it in as well, it's fantastic to see.
Sounds like so much fun, Martin, but you know probably better than anybody that shooting a bad guy on screen with a game controller is completely different from shooting an actual gun in the real world.
Yeah, of course. But I think that it's not necessarily about sitting there playing a computer game either. It's more the benefits that the Army's getting. And I suppose Code Bowl as well, that the whole point of it is the Call of Duty Endowment Programme, supporting veterans. So of course, it's different from real military training, but again, that's not the point of it either.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, esports is about much more than that. Call of Duty is perhaps the most famous, but what's the wider value of investing the time and effort of servicemen and women into esports, Martin?
So I think it breaks down to a number of things. First one, obviously recruiting. There's a large amount of people that watched the Code Bowl. I think it was just under 100,000 people across various different channels. So yeah, the recruiting element of it. Skills development, essential skills such as strategic thinking, quick decision making, and teamwork, which are obviously crucial in our day-to-day work as well as people playing Call of Duty. It's a fast-paced game. And really takes on some of the aspects that are required by people when they're serving.
And Simon, as you alluded to, it's not just the UK that sees value in all of this.
Absolutely not. it was interesting when speaking to some of the American players and the Canadians as well, that they were echoing the sentiments that we heard from the British teams, that this, of course, as Martin has mentioned, is extremely valuable when it comes to some of those skills that people learn through Call of Duty games and esports in general. And also when it comes to, I guess, helping recruitment potentially, because that was something that was mentioned by some of the representatives in the tournament. So everyone comes together, I think, with the same mindset, even though they're obviously going head-to-head in the game itself. But I think that global aspect makes it even more interesting. It helps to generate all of that hype, and it helps to probably get more eyes on the tournament as well. So that can only be a good thing. I spoke to Jason Fox, Foxy off SAS Who Dares Wins fame. He had turned up to give his support to some of the teams and some of the players. And when speaking to him about some of those benefits, he said it's absolutely wonderful. Of course, when it comes to actual practical motor skills of battlefield scenarios, then you need to be out and about doing those. But he said in terms of the visual aspect of helping service personnel to understand, how to make split-second decisions and where they need to be at a given time, he said it's a wonderful thing.
So, Martin, how do you feel competitive esports have developed you?
I think that other people that I've been able to help has probably benefited them more than me personally. But for a signaller to have a direct conversation with senior NCOs and warrant officers, I think that's the benefit of military esports, that there's no rank there. People can get honest opinion of what they're doing, and being able to bring other people for a sport where maybe they wouldn't make the rugby or football team. Not that there's a stereotype of what esports is, but I think that's probably what I bring to it rather than take out of it more.
And what do you see it doing for those that you work with?
I think that it gives them a hobby outside of work. Again, if they don't play rugby, football, traditional sports, that they've grown up playing computer games, is something that not only is it just them sitting in their room on their own, but being able to compete at a high level against other people. It's really, really good to see.
So, Martin, I mean, I know it's a game, but in terms of the tournament, how competitive is it, and how strong is the competition to get there in the first place, to be within the army, to actually get into the Code Bowl team?
It's hugely competitive. The 4 players that played are definitely the best 4 in the army, and no doubt from the other services as well that they're the best within their service. The army specifically, it's a 4-week process to select who's going to be in the team, and it's rigorous for the fact that people are going to get a trip to America at the end of it. Various competitions throughout the year that they must be involved in, and usually do quite well in them.
And Martin, when did you start playing?
From a very young age, but definitely not as good as the current players anymore. So that's why I'm managing the team now.
And what about you, Simon? Did you have a go at taking them on at all?
Not me, I must say, Kate, but our colleague David Hubert, who joined me on the trip, he did. And I think it's fair to say that when he went up against one of the RAF guys, he was soundly beaten, and that might be a diplomatic way of putting it. But it was just interesting to see how those different levels matched up. David likes his gaming, and it was great because he was like a kid at Christmas trying out some Call of Duty stuff. But yeah, the level, as Martin has alluded to, the standard is phenomenal. And it was interesting, actually, when speaking to one of the Royal Air Force Reserve players, he was saying that I think that the difference between him making the trip and not, because he was back in the UK, was something like 5 or 6 kills over a period of 8 hours of gaming. So a tiny margin that left him out of it.
Wow, very stiff competition. Martin, then, what is next in terms of esports for the armed forces then?
So I think that esports, to get bigger really and get more people involved in it is the first thing that us in the army have got to do. And then looking forward to placing better than we did this year. We came 5th. Our process will be focusing towards that and the other tournaments that lead up to that again.
Why do you think the RAF beat you?
Just better on the day, I think. We've played a number of tournaments against them throughout the year, and the margins are really slim, as Simon alluded to, and just did better than us on the day.
Martin Dixon, Simon Hunter, good to speak to you. Thank you so much. Good luck next time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, Mike, are you more esports or rugby?
Rugby for me. Yeah, I've never played Call of Duty.
Yeah.
I've never played any computer game. Wrong generation. So, I mean, I've spent my life reading books and playing cricket. But I absolutely recognise the value of these to a generation of men and women in the armed forces, because it's part of modern warfare, both in training and the reality of modern warfare as it becomes more technologically sophisticated down at the lowest levels.
How much do you think they've learned then from gaming hardware and software for other synthetic training, which actually is incredibly realistic?
It is. And the point about synthetic training is it's so good now that it's not a substitute for real training, but it's a close substitute. And it certainly can be an absolute substitute for the intellectual requirement of thinking quickly, being situational aware, and so on. I mean, as we said in the report there, you do have to get out and about at some point, but you can go 90% of the way intellectually through simulation training, and simulated environments are incredibly realistic. And I have played about in simulated environments, and very quickly they feel very real to you. After 2 or 3 minutes trying to fly a plane or whatever it might be, you are absolutely involved in the cockpit procedures, because the screen you're looking at that surrounds you on all sides seems completely real. And it really matters to you to land this plane properly or to fly it properly, whatever it might be.
Yeah, we talked a few months ago about traditional war gaming and its real application as a military tool. Both have repurposed an entertainment concept to test and develop skill sets that need to be used in parallel. That's how training works.
Yes, it does. And one of the good things about this is that Britain is way ahead of almost any other country at the development of gaming software. It's one of the areas of real strength in our soft power and our modern technologies. So we're ahead on this, and I think we're close to being ahead. If we're not ahead of the United States, we're very close to the US in being able to apply this as training techniques. So they are very, very good. And although I'm not part of it, as I say, I'm the wrong generation, but I absolutely see the benefits of these things. And it's one way in which, when defense budgets are under such pressure, it's one way of actually substituting 90% accuracy for something that you just don't have the money to go out and do, and don't have the requirement to do regularly.
Really interesting. Now, finally this time, an insight into a particularly specialised military role, the many medical professionals who are an essential part of every fighting force, from home base to the front line. Major General Tim Hodgetts has done it all, from being the most junior doctor to leading British military medicine as Surgeon General across a 41-year career. He's just retired from that post and the army, and he will tell us all about that career very shortly. But he's also revealed another surprising string to his bow. He's also a poet, inspired by his experience of crisis and war. He'd kept it largely private until now, and he's just published a collection called Frontlines and Lifelines. It includes this very personal reflection on his role.
A doctor or a soldier first, a common ask by those unversed in risks they cannot understand, nor visualise like glove on hand, sits medicine on soldiering. For in dilemma floundering, young doctors in a firefight choose between their oath or life to lose, while Red Cross armbands have become a target for the sniper's gun.
Major General Tim Hodgetts, welcome to SITREP. Thank you for your time. That poem there, that speaks pretty clearly for itself. When did you write it?
So I wrote that particular poem in Afghanistan in 2007. And indeed, many of the poems that I've written have been written in near real time as a means of reflecting on a difficult situation that I've been in.
And that question, doctor or soldier, who do you tend to get that question from? Is it the medical community, military, unconnected civilians, or is it a bit of all of them, or one perhaps you just ask yourself?
Well, I think all of what you've stated there, I've asked it of myself. But yes, it is a question that I am asked relatively frequently, perhaps by people not in the military. But the answer is, of course, it depends. Because if I'm in a situation where I'm being shot at, then I am entitled to defend myself. But as soon as you put a patient in front of me, then I will become laser focused on that individual, and I will be reliant on others around me to provide that protection.
When did the poetry writing actually start then? I mean, you have so many experiences to draw upon.
Well, I probably started poetry writing in the early 1990s. Initially, I wrote some rhythms for rhyme, which were very simple 4-line poems to help you remember what to do if you are confronted with a cardiac arrest. So ventricular fibrillation, the squiggly line on your electrocardiogram, your heart tracing, that was 200, 200, 360 then, tube IV, adrenaline, 3 minutes CPR, and then 360 thrice and round again. And I wrote little rhymes that would help me, but of course they would also help others. So they were published in a medical journal.
And we'll talk more about the poetry in a bit, but it's very much inspired by your 41-year career in the army. That must have given you a huge range of experiences to draw upon.
It has, and I sometimes think that disaster has followed me around, or perhaps I've sought out disaster in my career. So yes, I've had some very challenging experiences from very early on. Even as a junior doctor in Germany in the late 1980s, I was confronted with terrorism. There were 2 car bombs in the adjacent street to where we lived, drive-by shootings at the military hospitals, of course, the shootings at Channel ports, and also bombs in other parts of Germany where British soldiers were stationed. So I was thinking very heavily about what I would do if I was confronted with a situation of multiple casualties, particularly with a bombing. And indeed, I wrote my first book as a junior doctor. I remember on a £30 Boots typewriter, I did my first book, and I even did my own drawings for that. But it turned out to be extremely prudent thinking because in 1991, I was in Belfast as a middle grade doctor when the IRA blew up the hospital. And although I wasn't the senior rank, I was actually the most qualified. I'd done the exams about pre-hospital emergency care. I'd done that thinking. I'd published about what you would do in a multiple casualty incident. So I did take charge as the medical commander. And for me, that was a day that changed my life because it completely changed my career direction.
It's interesting that you said that you felt that disaster has followed you around in your career, but in your job, I mean, as a director of field hospitals at least 6 times, I mean, it's bound to happen, isn't it?
It certainly is. And when you're in a field hospital that has very finite resources in terms of people, in terms of the equipment that you carry, then a relatively small burst of casualties can tip you into what we call a major incident mode, where you need to draw everybody in, all the off-duty staff. In the civilian setting, where the hospitals are much bigger and there's more ability to absorb a burst in casualties, then you less frequently tip into that major incident mode. But the principles are the same, and the principles that I designed and wrote a course for after that experience in Northern Ireland are absolutely applicable in the civil or the military environment in any country. And indeed, it has become the standard around the world for both civil and military practitioners what to do in a major incident.
And how was it working in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, these are some of the most challenging places that I have been to work, but also from a medical perspective, some of the most rewarding, because it was the experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan that drove us to develop the combat casualty care practices. And indeed, I can prove a revolution in combat casualty care in the first 10 years of this century. And indeed, I've published a thesis on it that you can find online if you're interested in reading. But every major conflict in the last couple of 100 years, you can see where medicine advances.
Yeah, you said that it was those deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan were among the most rewarding, but also the most challenging. What made them so challenging?
Well, it was partly the intensity of the number of casualties, the sheer volume that you're working 7 days a week, 16 hours a day. And when you go to bed, you're out of bed again to treat the next injured casualty. So a very intense clinical experience. Also the physical threat. When I was the doctor on the helicopter, then you would be flying forward into the poppy field. You'd be being strafed by machine gun fire, mortars walking to your position as you run out the back to find the patients, throw them onto the helicopter and take off, as the poem says, as if you're on a giant bungee, because you only spend a couple of minutes on the ground. because the helicopter, the medical helicopter, was target number one.
And you have just retired from the post of Surgeon General, a well-known title to many people, but most of us probably don't understand what exactly that job involves. Can you explain it?
So the Surgeon General is the functional leader for defence medicine, so the senior clinical authority. So whether that's medical policy, guidelines, any difficult medical issues will ultimately end up on the Surgeon General's desk. I still regard everything I do as clinically focused. It's just doing it on a grander scale. So rather than thinking how you are improving the outcome of an individual patient, you're thinking about how you're improving the outcome of a group of patients. Because underneath the Surgeon General sits the pillar for research and innovation. So we are driving the research, driving up the standards, changing the guidelines constantly to seek better and better outcomes.
And when you think about the innovations that you've seen in your time, what stands out the most to you?
I've analysed this in detail. I can show you a great slideshow with what makes the greatest difference. You could say, was it the tourniquets? Was it the topical hemostatics? Was it the massive transfusion protocols that were brought in? But actually, I would put it down to the data. We collected exquisite data from point of wounding all the way through to rehabilitation. I set the system for that up in 1997. I started it in Frimley Park in an NHS hospital where military staff work. And then I turned that into the system that we use to collect data on operations. And it was that aggressive scrutiny of the detail of every seriously injured or fatally wounded soldier and learning from every single individual that drove us week on week to improve. So it was the fact that we were able to demonstrate which individual changes, whether it was a change to equipment or training, was really making a difference. And we then found ourselves pushing against an open door. Because if you can tell your leaders, if you can tell the politicians that, look, we are doing well, but we could do better with a little bit more investment, then people were very happy to support because you could provide the evidence of change.
Major General Tim Hodgetts, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Mike, it's so fascinating talking to Tim, and he follows in that long tradition, doesn't he, of war poets?
Yes, he does. It's a very honourable tradition as well. I mean, you know, some of the classic war poets, we always think of Wilfred Owen, who was killed, of course, in the final offensive of the war, a couple of days before the armistice, crossing the Sambre Canal. And Siegfried Sassoon, who survived the war and wrote very resonant poems, Memory, Banishment, Aftermath, very good poems indeed. And then Lawrence Binyon, whose verses we hear at least once a year, you know, they shall grow not old, that we that are left grow old. But, you know, listening to that, I hadn't heard any of Tim's stuff before. And the poem that he was reading at the very beginning of that clip talked about life to lose. And that brings to mind for me the most resonant of all war poetry, the last couple of lines of A. Houseman's Here Dead We Lie. And the last two lines are, life, to be sure, is nothing much to lose, but young men think it, and we were young.
And on that note, we'll leave it for this time. Mike, thank you so much. And my thanks to all of our guests. That is almost all for now, but you can hear much more about Major General Tim Hodgetts' war poetry and his extraordinary career in an extra edition of the SITREP podcast online now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another SITREP next Thursday. Until then, from me, Kate Chabot, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.